This podcast is a part of the Garnett Media Group podcast network. Garnett Media Group is the official partnership between student-run media outlets at the University of South Carolina. For more information on GMG podcasts or other student work, visit garnettmedia.org. Hi, my name is Dr. Jabari Evans, and welcome to Uncommon Knowledge, the podcast where we talk about all things spanning race and representation within mass media. This podcast is a partnership between the School of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of South Carolina and Garnett Media Group. So without further ado, let's get into this week's episode. Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge, where we talk to scholars, journalists, and trendsetters to discuss media representation, race, gender, and contemporary society. I am your host, Dr. Jabari Evans, and today's guest is Dr. David Crockett. David Crockett is a professor of marketing at the University of Illinois at Chicago. His primary research interest is in the sociological aspects of consumer behavior, particularly the consequences of social inequality, and his research investigates the creation, manifestation, and resolution of class, race, and gender in the marketplace. He also addresses consumer, managerial, and public policy initiatives designed to alleviate inequality. Dr. Crockett and I had a spirited conversation thinking about the branding of race, particularly in thinking about Black people. But we also had a conversation about sports media and sports media marketing as it pertains to women athletes and women's sports leagues professionally. I hope you enjoy this conversation. We will kind of join in midway through our formal conversation where Dr. Crockett was talking about his work with a friend of mine from undergraduate, Dr. Cassie Pittman, and the work that they did on race and representation within retail spaces, and a work that was commissioned very specifically by Sephora. So welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. Let's get right into it.
So Sephora had been having issues with racist treatment of customers in any number of its outlets. And so that kind of set them on a journey. So this is going back a few years. That kind of set them on a journey. And I always say this, so the thing with, I didn't understand cosmetics at all as I entered this project.
Right.
And so some things about it, kind of why they were interested in wanting to understand more about racism and how it worked, was intriguing to me. Kind of like, why is this an issue for them? I mean, obviously it was bad publicity, but you've been in advertising and media, and representation, and that in many instances for these companies, they're just waiting for 5 minutes to pass so that the next thing happens and people take their mind off of whatever caused the bad publicity, right? They ended up sending out a request for proposal, and Cassie reached out to me. We were fans, kind of each other's work, because other people are like, hey, do you know this Cassie Pittman? She's doing some real interesting stuff. And people were kind of saying the same thing to her. So she reached out to me and said, hey, what do you think about working on something together? And I was like, fanboying out, like I was like, I would love to work on like whatever you want to do, let's do it. So we ended up, I won't get into all of the specifics about the request and all that, but they ended up choosing our proposal. So we worked with the higher ups, including the chief marketing officer at Sephora, along with a marketing and research firm called Kelton Global.
Okay.
And, a lot of what they were really interested in having done is to try to understand the different places where racism impacts customers all along the steps of their journey. So from the time you're thinking, hey, I really want to change my look, all the way up to and including a visit to the store, the visit to the website, and everything that kind of happens after that. because one of the things that had become apparent to them, they also, I should note, they worked with another kind of broad, I'll call them generally a public relations firm. They're more than that, but they work with a public relations firm that, you know, got them to think more deeply about these issues and paired them with something of an advisory board that has a number of activists, other kinds of folks who are in industry. So you might know the name Brittany Packnett.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So she's on this advisory board. And so they had, you know, like serious people kind of in their ear saying, y'all need to change, but you can't just kind of go do some stuff. You can't just write a check to the United Negro College Fund. You really need to understand in a deep way what's happening to consumers kind of all along the journey.
Right.
And so that's where they ended up kind of connecting with us. And so we helped them develop some frameworks for thinking about, well, actually, the notion of the customer journey. You know, we helped them kind of develop that through a kind of racialized lens. So, you know, kind of in a nutshell, we ended up working with them and Kelton, and we had a huge data set, both qualitative and quantitative data, you know, like all the things, right? So we, you know, we went through a lot, and really like what people were telling us is that their experiences at retail, this will not shock you, that their experiences at retail were simply not good. I think one of the things that was something of a surprise to Sephora, just kind of as an example, is the welcome when you enter the store. And I believe that they kind of thought of that as, you know, a universal warm and fuzzy. And one of the things that came out of the data is that for shoppers of color, they're more ambivalent about that, because a lot of people recognize that when you're greeted upon entry to the store, that's theft prevention, right? In many instances, right? Someone is there saying, I know that you walked in, and I just want you to know that I know that you walked in here, right? And so many people, like, they didn't find that welcoming, you know, and so, you know, some of that was kind of like, it was new, it was insightful for them. And I think a lot of it from their standpoint was kind of like, no one thing blew their mind, but they didn't have a full picture of everything. You know, they were serious about collecting data, but they didn't have some ways to really think about what they would, you know, you're a scholar, you need some frameworks, right? To really take the data in and have it be meaningful. You need ways to think about it. And so that's kind of what Cassie and I helped them do. You know, the last thing I'll say, if any follow-ups, I'm open to hear.
Sure.
The thing that for me was so kind of interesting and surprising as someone who was, you know, brand new to the cosmetics space, I was trying to describe it to a buddy of mine. You know, when you walk into one of these places, I don't know if you've ever been into a Sephora, like one of the big retail outlets.
Once or twice.
Yeah, it's a lot, right? You know, can I get an amen?
Buy something for someone else, clearly.
Bro, it's a lot when you walk up in there. At one point, I was kind of like, oh, this is like hiring a contractor for your face. You know what I mean? Right? It's deep. And this was actually an animating feature for Sephora, because in many ways, this very intimate interpersonal interaction with people is what they sell.
Right.
That is their business.
Right.
You know what I mean? And so they couldn't very well have people kind of walking into their place and having a horrible interpersonal, like that dog won't hunt for them. And so, I mean, it's not like they didn't know this, but like knowing something and doing something about it are two different things, right? You need frameworks, you need theory to help you begin to walk through some of these issues. And my hope is that that's kind of what we began to provide for them. They've been serious. You know, we've been in contact, particularly with some of their diversity people since the study. we made sure we didn't walk out of there without putting some real specific benchmarks in place. These are the things we're going to do by this time so that you can measure them. And so, we're proud of the work that we did there.
Yeah, no, it sounds like it was an erstwhile effort. Like some of those partnerships that I've even partnerships that I was a part of, like as a master's student as well as a doctoral student, and even some newer stuff that I've been doing since becoming a professor. I'm thinking specifically, I did some work with Netflix on their 13 Reasons Why series when there was a lot of backlash about what that might be doing for teens in terms of depression and suicide. And then also this project that I'm now working on with Burrell Communications, which is in Chicago. And and they're thinking about like, okay, we've been seen for years as the Black agency, and now we want to kind of move into the general market, but we don't want to lose our identity. We want to just be able to tell individuals that Black culture is the culture. And so in hiring us, you're going to hire the Pulse. And then it's not simply just us putting Black people in McDonald's commercials. It's, the ethos of what it means to be Black. In both of those instances, though, Netflix as well as Burrell, there's ideas of what they want the outcomes of the research to be already. And so us as like real scholars, real professionals about our methods and even in terms of pointing out and mining through data. On one end, it's like when you get the keys to the castle, it's a beautiful thing to be able to say, I can do quantitative, I can do qualitative, I can get all this access. And often they want you to cherry pick things that fit the outcomes that they want. And it sounds like this was a genuine partnership. Now, you've been quoted as saying like that marketing is often axiologically thin. I guess in terms of other forms of communication, I don't know if that's necessarily the case. Like, so I think in advertising, journalism, even public relations, I think there's been this emergence over the last maybe 10, 15 years of like people who really are thinking deeply about the role of racism. Why do you think marketing might differ from those forms? Or why do you think maybe it's taken more time for, you to have like a community of people who do the work?
Right. I mean, that's a great question. So I will tell you right off the bat, I don't have an answer that I would say to you is dispositive, right? Like, this is the answer and no other answers are possible. What I'd say, so first, just in terms of the claim about marketing and axiology. So, the axiology is those sort of deeply held, usually normative kinds of beliefs, right? The things that ought to be and not just what is. And I would say historically, marketing is one of the disciplines that filters out of economics. And economics is, of course, famous for kind of not having very much axiology at all. At least it sort of thinks that it doesn't, right? So it's sort of like, hey, tastes are just given, right? You like what you like, and that's kind of the end of it. And in many ways, marketing has, at least at a surface level, kind of taken on those same basic assumptions, which on the one hand is helpful to someone like me who's coming in and I want to study, what, back in the 1990s when I first started, it wasn't like I was the first person who ever looked at race in the marketplace or anything like that, but it was still niche, it was still marginal and marginalized, in its own way. But at the same time, because the field sort of thinks of itself as really open, kind of you can study whatever, there was space where you could build. So I could start sort of, as long as I could kind of make a case for why this is relevant to either marketing practitioners or other marketing scholars, I could kind of do the thing that I wanted to do, right? So in terms of kind of what's gone on and I should say that this matters, right? My argument is that this is why you can have advertisements that on the one hand, you have tons of companies that sell lots of products to Black people and never make any mention of race in any of their communications.
Right.
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 And on the other hand, you can have companies that very explicitly and expressly both target Black people and utilize features of Black culture in almost all of their communications. That those two approaches can kind of live in the same discipline at the same time is what I mean by, hey, this is axiologically thin, and so they can kind of cohabit, right? If you want to sort of think about kind of why there has been this change over the last, fill in the blank, number of years, right? What I would say to you, and this I'm going to credit, do you know Jason Chambers? He's at University of Illinois.
Yes, I don't know him personally, but I do know who he is, yes.
Right. So Jason gave a talk for the the Advertising Education Foundation. This is probably, it'll be a good year or so ago, maybe a year plus in the spring. Anyway, I've been a big fan of Jason's work for a really long time. And he basically does a really cool historical analysis of racial representations generally, but with a focus on Blackness representations in corporate communications, this advertising and other stuff. Really does a nice trace back. And basically what he shows is that on matters of race, about once a decade, companies, en masse are ready to sort of have a conversation. Right. The slogan that they use changes over time, but he basically says every 10, 12 years or so, there's a moment when you can, and we've been through one of those moments in the summer of 2020, but then you can kind of go back and there was another moment about 10 years prior, right? And so forth. And so whenever we're sort of saying, hey, why has it changed? Well, there's kind of a rhythm to these things.
Yep.
Right. Chuck D used to say problems have to be solved. They don't go away.
Yep.
And I think this is kind of what you're seeing, that companies kind of get ready, like there's a moment that's bigger than just advertising. Something occurs and it's part of the zeitgeist, and you will see it in communications above anything, because that is the place where corporations touch people. It's through their advertising and other communications. So it's going to show up there.
Yeah, that's so crazy. You're touching on all of these different signposts that I kind of had in my notes, and particularly you used the word that I was thinking about, which is zeitgeist. Something that I use in this class that I teach now, minorities, women in the media. We have a specific unit where we talk about Black Twitter and wokeness, and but then how it translates into capitalism. And so this idea that washing is a thing.
Yes.
Changing Aunt Jemima to Pearl Milling, Colin Kaepernick getting a Nike campaign,
right?
Marvel investing more into the Black Panther character. All of these things have led to a branding of wokeness, but are these compensatory measures? Are these actually just empty offerings through corporate communication? Like, what are kind of your feelings? Like, do these things really deserve to be lifted up or placed on a pedestal as the marker of the ways that we should think about culture and race, or is there something more that can be done through even the discipline of marketing?
Sure. So, I mean, in some ways, the answer to your question is yes, right? it's all of these things.
No,
so, right? In terms of background, and I'm glad you led with capitalism, so I can lead with that, right? So, you have a system that is, and a particular moment in capitalism, right? That is both corporate dominated, but then inside of being dominated by large corporations, dominated most expressly by their finance function, right? And that this matters for eventually kind of how all of these organizations develop a notion of common sense, like what it makes sense for them to do and what it makes sense for them to try to pursue. And so on the one hand, you have, because these organizations have so much invested, they are in one sense extraordinarily sensitive to certain kinds of criticisms, right? And so, post 1960s and 70s, corporations absolutely have to care about not just the Black consumer segment, right? Because they're not all expressly targeting Black people, but they also have to worry more generally about how they are perceived in a society that, at least on the surface, values a certain kind of diversity, values at least by process, kind of values a certain kind of equality. So they have to operate kind of within some strictures. But this is to never really threaten their bottom line, right? Their possessive investment in what George Lipsitz called the possessive investment in whiteness. All of these things are never to kind of threaten that. And so, to me, the best example is finance itself, and particularly banking. That the FIRE segment of the economy, so that's finance, insurance, real estate. If you turn on broadcast TV right now, the main advertisements that you're seeing are for insurance. I think insurance companies are like 3 of the top 5 biggest advertising spenders right now. They're way up there. So I think I can kind of summarize this, and I'll just give a quick example here. So the point here is that all of these moments are important. Corporations can be pushed at moments to do some things they don't overly want to do. But the limits within which you can push them are often quite narrow. But what you can accomplish, sometimes even within those limits, can be super important. It can be life and death, for people, right? Like, hey, I will tell you, like, over the last year plus, I've seen more people who are aware about, the pulse oximeter issue, right? So the thing that measures your pulse if you have heart problems, it can tell you, whether you're about to have a heart attack.
Right.
More and more people are aware that those things don't work as well on people with dark skin, right? They reflect light, right? And so I remember saying this in a talk that I gave a few months ago, that if you reverse the races there, and you had a tech product that reflected light off skin and it didn't work for white people, it wouldn't even make it out of the testing stage.
Yeah.
Right. That's a fatal flaw. And so it's like nobody had to sit down and be mean about it. We're just talking about kind of the system that we live in. And so, even there's a bigger push, like companies have been made aware, like this is an issue and it needs to be fixed. Now, it's been an issue for a while. Aunt Jemima ceased to be in 2021, but I know people who worked on that campaign, for years and years, and many of those Black executives at Quaker were trying to get them to drop that brand decades ago. Right. And so these things, the marketplace is one site in which we are constantly having to battle racism and its effects, right? So not just people's bad attitudes, but a system that will allow a product that that doesn't work for Black people or works less well for Black people, but could be life or death, to go to the marketplace without innovation and sit there for a long time without innovation, right? Like that's a struggle that's worth engaging in. Will some corporations faking it? Yeah, of course they are, right? But we push them to the extent that we can.
Right. I think, it's a tough thing because it's like, all right, we want progress, we want change. And it's something that we I think have been very vocal about, particularly in the space of, social media and that sort of being this equalizer of us being able to say, well, who is the intended person for the solution? Who is the normal, the normal audience member? But then, there's also a part of me that always feels like, well, why all these people had to die for
of course
to get to this space? Or when the press coverage dies down, is this going to be meaningful? Or does end racism on the back of a football helmet necessarily, like at a certain point, is it just background music? Are we actually paying attention to what the whole point of it was in the first place? And one of the things that I've started to think about is whether this idea of street politics, which I talk about in the context of hip hop, versus respectability politics, both of those are used to reach Black demographics. I'm starting to think that it's almost better to be, on the side of the embracing of the ratchet as much as to resisting it as a way of saying, like, this is the way that we need to be seen and heard. I guess I would want to know, like, what are your feelings about the place that we're at in terms of those types of binaries, in terms of how, we reach certain types of Black folks versus others, or even this idea that this idea that there's a need for us to change Uncle Ben, or there's a need for us to change Aunt Jemima. Maybe it's more of a need to change the DNA of the culture that is making this image appear to be clownish versus giving it a reverence, because there were some people who were sad about that. They were like, the nostalgia is also thing. I want to say the family of Uncle Ben, they were just like, we wanted to just get paid fairly for it, but we were proud of that image. We weren't necessarily looking at him as a Sambo on this bag. Is there a middle ground that maybe we're missing, the blind spots,
Right. I mean, that's it's of course an age-old question. What I'd say, just on the politics surrounding the problem of representation, is that in many ways, like, that is the most complex one, right? There's some places where our task is very clear, right? Like, you got a whole bunch of companies that just won't hire Black people. You know what I mean? Like, you know what I'm saying? And so, the task ahead of us is like, listen, like, these are jobs that people need to live. Like, you can't use our roads and our taxes and just flat refuse to hire Black people and other people of color. Like, that's not going to cut it, right? And so, so you have those where what we have to do is relatively clear. The issue with representation is that it operates kind of at every level, right? So on the one hand, it can be intensely personal, right? In the same way that, Tiger Woods, called, what was it, Caliblation? Back in the day, right?
Talib Kweli called him out on it. Was it Cablinasian?
Yeah. Which, like, that's about personal identity, right? And that can be meaningful, right? Like, we can have a debate about what appropriate meaning is, but on some level, this stuff is idiosyncratic to identity, but it also works in this interpersonal way that's across, not just about me and my identity, but about us, as a group, and how we want to be perceived and so forth. And then at the macro level, this stuff sets cultural templates for how people can even understand the world, right? We know for a fact, for example, that people see Black children as bigger and older than they actually are. Yeah. Right? Like their literal perception is shaped by the culture. Well, so you have a phenomena that is operating at the micro, meso, and macro level of kind of abstraction, right? And so, which is what makes fights about representation difficult. I run into a number of people, generally boomers, who have been, who have some bit of nostalgia about Aunt Jemima. Right. That this is not uncommon because, it's not nonsensical, right? Like for them, like that was the only image there was. And so like, that's what they rolled with. Right. And so they have investment in that, and so that's what makes this stuff difficult is the wrong word. It means that the politics of it, like all politics, are negotiated, right, over time. There was a historian who came to USC a couple years ago, a radical historian, and I was like a little bit surprised to hear that person say that, they didn't like all of the kind of bringing down all the different monuments, racist monuments, that they didn't think that that was necessarily a good idea in all circumstances. I was like, what? Like, and, and as they kind of talked it out, I mean, I sort of recognized, some amount of validity to the point, right? Where it's kind of like, we can't pretend that these things were not so. And it would be, as a practical matter, like impossible to remove every single monument everywhere. And that for at least some of the time, what we're going to have to do is better historicize the monuments that are there, right? What makes the monuments powerful is that they tell a story. And what we need in many ways is to have broader co-authorship of that story. And that is simply what these things look like and what they have always looked like, right? When we go back and read the history books, the mistake in our interpretation is often that the outcome seemed inevitable, right? And we gloss over all of the arguments that went into, well, what are we going to do next Saturday when this march is scheduled, right? Are we going to have children there who could be harmed or not? That was a big debate in the civil rights movement. We've mostly glossed over that, right? Because the kids came, right? And so, that bit of difficulty, that bit of ugliness, all of that stuff, we're doing the things as we hash these things out that other folks have done. And let me just tell you, you can quickly disabuse yourself of the notion that you will not make any mistakes. You will make some mistakes.
Right. No, it's just, that's a poignant way of putting it. Like, I guess I've been wrestling with this as like, so my position at USC is, I'm in the journalism school, I'm in mass communication, but my title is specifically assistant professor of race and media. And I feel like because of that, every single day, not just thinking about research, but in teaching, I'm having conversations with a largely white audience, race and gender, and but usually framing it in the midst of intersectionality. And there's so many different, and I also see now that I've turned 40, I see the generational differences in which authentic Blackness shows up, or concepts of what diversity means, that shows up. And so I've had to, in an interesting and fun way, wrestle with different ideologies and and just coming to terms with like even seeing like those who are closer to my son's generation, what their thought of is, because even the term intersectionality, right? I associated immediately with Black women. And like my students, they immediately associated with LGBTQ plus communities. And I was like, wait a minute, like, yes, okay, Black trans women, yes, okay.
Right.
They're like, no, Dr. Evans is
Uh-huh.
it's this. That's
Mm-hmm.
intersectionality, or
Mm-hmm.
intersectionality could be an Asian woman,
Mm-hmm.
or it could be, these identities that we're missing. Those are the blind
Mm-hmm.
spots now. And I'm like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
okay, so the wrestle over gender is where you see the focus. Um,
Right.
and I'm like, but you also need to know that, like, where this canon of work comes from is thinking about
Absolutely.
Black
Mm-hmm.
women.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that like piqued the interest of my
Oh.
Black women students, because they were like,
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know that,
Right.
but
Right.
I'm seeing how, like, it's this idea of diversity, even equity, or and inclusion, these
Mm-hmm.
things that are everywhere, even in academia, can be branded differently, right?
Yes, sir.
And
Yes,
that's
sir.
definitely a marketing thing, even on the campuses
Mm-hmm.
that we work at. Those
Mm-hmm.
are some interesting things to explore. Now,
Mm-hmm.
before I let you go, I mean, I have two
Mm-hmm.
questions left, but I
Yeah.
have to have at least one just curveball about sport.
Okay.
And so a barbershop conversation that I had literally today was
Mm.
about kind of this very topic of intersectionality in
Mm-hmm.
sport. And we were talking about the WNBA.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think the WNBA did actually some of the most important work during this
Mm-hmm.
time of, like, Black Lives Matter and
Yep.
social unrest around George Floyd, and
Yep.
even getting Warnock into
Mm-hmm.
office,
Mm-hmm.
right? But there's still, like, this second class citizen feel to
Yeah.
what their sport is. I mean, I,
Mm-hmm.
I would say even women's college basketball seems to have
Mm-hmm.
a better profile than
Mm-hmm.
WNBA.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, and what do you think can be actually done to market the league better
Yeah.
and its
Wow.
stars better,
Mm-hmm.
um, to audiences? And I think this is just a diversion away from what we've been talking about. But
Mm-hmm.
there were a lot of different answers, and I'd be, you know, interested to hear your opinion on that.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, it's that one's it's complex in the sense that um so just kind of like to give some background. I mean, it's worth saying because one of the dangers of this conversation is a US lens where women's basketball is not big. But
Hmm.
if you zoom out, right, you see that there are lots of places in the world where women's basketball is pretty big.
Really? Yeah.
Well, I mean, listen, like, why was Brittany Griner in Russia in the first place?
Yes.
Right? Because a lot of the players in the WNBA have to go overseas, typically to Europe, to get that bag. What they make in the WNBA is not really going to put food on the table, right? So to get their bag, they got to go overseas, and that's where she was, right? She had been over there playing.
Yep.
When all that stuff kind of went down, right? So let's kind of give it that sort of broader background where in some ways the US is a bit of an outlier in the sense that women's sports are really marginalized here. So basketball and soccer probably being the two biggest ones, though I would also add, because there's always complexity and nuance, where I'd say women's tennis in the US is about as big as men's. In fact, I think it's bigger in terms of TV ratings and viewership and stuff like that. Now, there are some ways that professional tennis has kind of gone out of its way to have practices that are consistent with people's expectations about gender, right? And so this is all relevant, right? Because I think with women's basketball, you don't have that, right? It's not the sport itself is not genteel. It's not sort of upper class in the way that tennis and golf are,
Right.
right? So you kind of start with that. Because in order to understand kind of what you can do to overcome barriers, you really have to have a nuanced understanding of what the barriers are, right? Like it's not simply a matter of mostly men having negative attitudes about women hoopers,
Right.
So part of, I think, sort of the issue that confronts the WNBA is that in many ways they are at the same place that a lot of relatively young sports are, right? Women have been playing basketball for a long time, but there have been only a handful of women's professional leagues. And what they have is in some ways the fundamental problem is similar for a variety of sports, and that is when you have a sport that has a real regional component to it. And so there are a handful of hotspots for women's basketball. South Carolina is quickly becoming one.
Yeah.
Right. So we know what Coach Dawn is doing there. But for a long time, that was kind of Connecticut, a bit of the Northeast, a couple of outposts in the Midwest. Chicago is pretty decent, in that regard, right? And so with professional sports leagues, it's hard to grow them market by market. And so there's just some basic business problems that the WNBA kind of has, where if you have a sport that is kind of spot market to spot market, it's just going to take longer to grow. Right. So in many ways, I don't feel like there's some big mistake that the WNBA has made where you go, oh, if you just tweak that thing, it'll take off. It doesn't work that way. I just think they have a long, arduous path to the kind of growth that you might see in a France or a Italy or a Spain or Russia, where women's basketball is bigger. But I would also argue that this is sort of women's sports generally. The cultural piece to it, which I suspect is what you're interested in, is about the extent to which some women's sports do not fit our expectations around gendered practice. Right? Right. So here's one of the dilemmas, and I actually really appreciate what the WNBA has done here in this regard. When you have sports like that, you have both attraction and repulsion. So for the folks for whom those gender ideals are really important, they've kind of fled that sport. They don't deal with it. For the folks who have very different ideas and ideals about gender, they have been really attracted to the sport. Right. So the WNBA has been a very LGBTQ friendly place. I mean, by necessity, like that's a core audience. You're not going anywhere without them. If you're the WNBA. And so the question for them is, do you set as your long-term goal to be the kind of brand that appeals to all people everywhere? I might suggest that that's a fool's errand, because not even the NBA is like that. Right. Or do you spend your time, your energy, your resources kind of understanding what your niche is, understanding kind of what the potential areas, what and where the potential areas for growth are, and then look to max those out? My suggestion, my way of thinking is that it should probably be the latter. Right? That you figure out kind of who you can be kind of under your, it's like, hey, if you play the Blues, you're not going to sell out Madison Square Garden. Right. But that doesn't mean that you can't make any money. Now, to the extent that the NBA is still kind of a part of this, and something of a subsidizer for it, that's going to be the question, right? Because the big thing they need in the current setup is they got to have a regular TV schedule. That's about the NBA and the pressure it can exert on its TV partners, right? Like that. It is as simple as that, right? You're in your 40s. I'm in my early 50s. I'm old enough to remember when the NBA Finals was not broadcast live in every market. In LA, it was on tape delay.
Or what? Yeah, yeah, they tell
right?
us stories. Yeah.
And so, in many ways, what really, I mean, obviously Jordan comes along and saves the NBA, though it had been somewhat on the upswing prior to that. It was really about the partnership between the league and the television sponsors, not because the league was all things to all people, but because it had a niche that advertisers were interested in.
Mm-hmm.
And that's brass tacks for
Yeah.
the league.
Yeah, I'm interested to see kind of, and I'm glad you pointed out that the LGBTQ piece, because I've made the argument in a couple of my classes that I think that's the reason why Dawn Staley isn't held up the way Gino Auriemma is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That even the makeup of their teams and the idea of what it looks like to be a UConn player versus what it looks like to be a Gamecock is markedly different, even just not necessarily from a skill standpoint, but from an aesthetic standpoint. Like they have a type that goes there. And there's there's more dog in Dawn's players. And that's just that lends well to winning. But even as they're winning, they're not getting the same level of visibility, which is that UConn's team got when they were dominant, or even when Pat Summitt's teams got when they were dominant. And I think even in seeing the 30 for 30 with the women's basketball team, the Olympic team, where they were talking about how they had to rebrand themselves or be more feminine to appeal to audiences. The fact that they're still in that time, or we're still in a time where that's even a thought where we can't bring up that's the differences we see. Because even when I hear folks talk about, and I think Dawn Staley's actually pointed this out. She says we don't get the coverage that we're dominant, and another dominant team that, if Gino was doing this, it would look different. And the argument could be that UConn is really close to ESPN, but that ain't all that it is. And so, and even going back to WNBA, I think I'm interested to see how the Aja Wilson approach works out, because she's made it a point to say, I'm not playing overseas. I want to be the highest paid player here. And I'm going to try to make the money back in branding and Nike and whoever else wants to buy into, but I want to be present in America, and I want to be a household name in America. Interested to see how that works out.
I think, I think you're right. I think if anybody has, a great shot at pulling that off, Asia does. I just don't know that you could be a lot more marketable than she was. Though I do think that, history matters, right? And we can kind of look back, and in many ways, that's what Lisa Leslie was at one time. Right. Lisa did all the things. And before her, Cheryl Miller, a lot of people forget how bad Cheryl was. I mean, y'all, you know what I'm saying?
Don't let them forget it.
I mean, she was
cold.
She was so good. And so, there have been other women who have, and Nancy Lieberman Klein, going back to when I was a kid, Nancy Lieberman was about that action. So she ain't going to be the first great women's basketball player. But I do think that the time is different. And there are some opportunities that might not have been available at other times. I just think the really critical thing for them is that they've got to get the TV right. That's what matters, so much, because that's, you get the audience. One thing, this is like a little bitty thing that, one of the things I appreciate about the WNBA is their willingness to experiment with a variety of different kinds of things. And I have often wondered if And I wonder if they have ever thought about this, but one of the things that can be really good for television is the only thing that I would copy from Major League Baseball is the way they do scheduling. Having mini series where you go to a city and you play 3 games lends itself towards a television product, because what you need is you've got to build narrative, and the narrative cannot just be around a player's greatness. Like I said, she ain't the only great player. You have to build narratives around matchups, and narratives around rivalries and grudge matches and so forth. Basketball in its history in the US was a barnstorming sport. That's why they went from city to city.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I wish the NBA would do the same thing, and it would cut down on all these rest days. We are way off topic. But I do think that in terms of the WNBA, if there was an innovation that I would love for them to consider, it's that one.
It might be different.
It makes it easier to broadcast your games because you have some, like, the schedule is there.
Yeah.
And it makes it sort of like people kind of know there's it's appointment television. It's not just one game. It's a variety of games. Oh, you didn't hear those two didn't like each other in the first game. Oh, now we're going to tune in and see the rubber match. I think it can really highlight the players in a very different way than what the NBA does.
Yeah, no, it's just, even as we were talking, I was just, one of the parts of the conversation in the barbershop that I was having was just this thought process that, like, Candace Parker pretty much has done what Michael Jordan did. Mm-hmm. and she's won at every level. And did, she was the wonderkin, the golden child, and did everything the way it was done. And yet and still, she's always had to go overseas, always had to kind of do has always sort of had to go out of her way to, I think she's gained more recognition for commentary on the men's game than her commentary on the women's game. And so it's just, I think A'ja Wilson is an extension of the blueprint for which Candace Parker has laid. I think we saw that changing of the guard happen in the playoffs this past year.
Right.
Like, I'm just really interested to see how more and more, especially with NIL and things that are going on right now, these young women who are coming out of college who are like, well, I'm already a millionaire. Maybe I could just stay here. Maybe that builds the game out where like, during their off seasons, they are spending more time promoting their brand and promoting themselves. I appreciate the conversation. I knew it was
absolutely
get off topic, but I still love it. I love having these types of dialogues documented. Before we get,
I'll just say this one thing, because I think you hit on the key point, that ultimately there's like a TV product for professional sports, and that's one thing. But the way you really build out a sport is at the youth level. And the difference between what happens, I don't necessarily need to see the men's side replicated, but what I can say is that you will get more women to play when the scholarship dollars go farther. It's as simple as that.
Yeah. Wow. And I think that's going to be something, particularly now that we're in this free for all of transfer portal and all of this stuff, that's going to be the thing that's going to set, I guess when the market sort of evens back out, the rules are set in place around sort of what's going on right now. I think when the dust clears, that's going to be very important, super important. Are there any questions that are like burning for you at this moment? Not necessarily questions that you're actively working on, questions that you're like, either you wish somebody else would work on, or questions that, you see in the near future that you're going to sort of approach?
Wow, that's a good one. So one, I would say kind of in my own discipline, I am kind of continually intrigued by the ways that, kind of quote unquote diversity, equity, and inclusion will continue to manifest themselves in markets. I have some general ideas about kind of how that works, but I'm not sure if they're right, and kind of only time will tell, right? I was kind of thinking before about the finance industry. So when the Biden administration said we're going to pay Black farmers, we admit to having discriminated against them, and we're going to pay Black farmers. We're going to pay off their loans because we screwed them over. Not only the government, but the banks did as well. And then that got held up in court on reverse discrimination grounds. This is despite the fact that there are tons of general funds for farmers that almost all go to white farmers. Turns out at the bottom of all of that was the big industry lobbying group for the top corporate banks. They were the ones who seeded the AstroTurf group that brought the lawsuit, right? They got the payment stopped. It turns out their interest in this is their revenue models are predicated on screwing Black people over, right? I mean, like their revenue models for a long time have been premised on Black people paying the Black tax. And so the government coming along and paying off those loans was not going to work for them, right? And so this kind of dynamic is as old as anti-racist action, right? There's anti-racist action and then there's backlash, right? So we knew that was coming some kind of way. The question is what now, right? And so, this kind of dynamic takes place in a variety of different ways, right? And so the question is, how will this continue to unfold in the aftermath of the 2020 moment, right? So the initial outlook is not necessarily great, but it's only the first quarter. So we shall see how that goes. I guess so. The other question is, I am fascinated to see how this name, image, and likeness stuff is going to transform the college landscape. I'm fairly agnostic on it, just as a matter of first principle. I believe that athletes are employees and should be paid like employees.
Right.
And so, it's also another, we will just see, kind of how it all plays out.
Oh man. Well, this is perfect. This is actually set up right on time, right on schedule. Man, I appreciate your time.
I appreciate you having me on.
Hope this is the first of many conversations.
Absolutely.
That's another episode of Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Dr. Jabari Evans. This is Dr. David Crockett signing out. Peace.
All right. Peace, y'all.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, leave a rating or review. And to catch the latest from me, you can follow me on Instagram at KnowledgeSense82 and on Twitter at KnowledgeSense82. Now that's different than how you normally would spell it. That's NALEDGE, Sense82, as in 1982. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time. Peace.